1960s, American cities were changing. Streets were crowded, suburbs were growing, and buses were becoming the backbone of daily life. For decades, General Motors had dominated the transit bus industry with its famous New Look design, a bus that became a symbol of city transportation across North America. They were everywhere, sleek, rounded, and reliable. To most people, the word city bus meant one thing: GM. But in the small town of Loudonville, Ohio, there was another company with a dream. Flxible, a bus maker with roots going back to the 1910s, had built its reputation on smaller coaches and intercity buses. They weren't as big as GM, but they had ambition. Flxible believed they could challenge the giant. They believed they could give cities an alternative to GM's monopoly. So in 1960, Flxible launched its own version of the New Look bus. It looked similar at first glance: angled windows, a modern streamlined body, and that signature futuristic vibe that was popular in the post-war era. But Flxible wanted to be different. They built their buses in shorter lengths and smaller sizes that could navigate narrow streets better than the larger GM models. Their pitch to city transit agencies was simple: why buy from GM when you can get something just as good, maybe even better, from us? At first, it seemed like a smart move. Some smaller cities liked the idea of having an alternative. Flxible buses began showing up in places like Atlanta, Dallas, and parts of the Midwest. They were cheaper than GM's buses, and they came from a company that actually listened to transit agencies. Flxible promised flexibility, hence the name. But behind the glossy brochures and sales talk, cracks were already showing. Flxible didn't have the same resources as GM. Their factories were smaller, their budgets tighter, and their research limited. GM poured millions into engineering and testing. Flxible had to cut corners to keep up. And while GM's New Look buses became famous for reliability, Flxible's version started to gain a different reputation. Mechanics complained about parts wearing out too quickly. Transit companies noticed the bodies didn't hold up as well under heavy use. Passengers felt the difference too. The ride wasn't as smooth, the interiors felt cheaper, and the overall quality just didn't match GM. Still, Flxible pushed forward. They believed they had a fighting chance. Their buses weren't perfect, but they were good enough to tempt agencies looking to save money or avoid being locked into GM's monopoly. And for a short while, Flxible looked like it could carve out a slice of the market. But GM was watching, and GM didn't like competition. By the mid-1960s, the battle lines were drawn. On one side was the giant General Motors, with nearly unlimited resources, powerful factories, and the loyalty of big cities across the continent. On the other side was the underdog, Flxible, scrappy, determined, but fragile. This wasn't just a fight about buses, it was a fight about survival. Because as the years rolled on, the weaknesses of the Flxible New Look bus became harder to ignore. And while GM's buses became icons of the streets, Flxible's would slowly fade into history as the flawed rival that never stood a chance. As the 1960s rolled into the 1970s, the bus wars were in full swing. General Motors stood tall, its New Look buses filling the streets of nearly every major American and Canadian city. They were nicknamed the Fishbowl buses because of their wide, curved windshields, and they became an icon of urban life. From New York to Los Angeles, from Toronto to Chicago, GM owned the streets. Flxible was trying to survive in the shadow of this giant. Their own New Look buses looked similar, but when you compared them side by side, the differences became clear. GM's buses were sturdier, smoother, and longer lasting. Flxible's buses, though cheaper, often showed wear and tear far sooner. Transit agencies were noticing. In places where both buses were tested, reports kept coming back. GM's vehicles handled daily punishment better. Flxible's smaller, lighter designs were more prone to rust, frame issues, and structural fatigue. For cities that needed buses to run 12 to 16 hours a day, every day, reliability wasn't optional, it was survival. Mechanics also had their frustrations. GM had a massive parts network, making repairs easier and faster. Flxible, on the other hand, struggled to provide quick replacements. Agencies found themselves waiting weeks for certain parts, and in the world of public transit, a bus out of service was money lost. But Flxible didn't give up. They tried to market their buses to mid-sized cities and towns that felt ignored by GM. They reminded buyers that competition was healthy, that GM's monopoly wasn't good for anyone. And for a while, some agencies agreed. Cities like Atlanta, Dallas, and several in Ohio bought fleets of Flxible buses, hoping to save money while supporting the underdog. Yet there was another problem: image. Riders didn't love the Flxible buses. Passengers complained about rough rides, noisy cabins, and seats that wore down quickly. In a business where public perception mattered, that was a dangerous weakness. Meanwhile, GM wasn't just sitting back. The company continued to innovate. They refined their designs, made their buses more efficient, and offered flexible options for different city needs. And because GM produced buses at such a massive scale, they could offer lower prices per unit than Flxible could ever hope to match. It was like watching a heavyweight boxer fight a challenger who was already tired before the first punch. Flxible tried to dodge, weave, and stay in the ring, but every year GM tightened its grip. By the late 1970s, GM controlled more than 80% of the transit bus market in North America. Flxible was barely hanging on. Desperation pushed Flxible to take risks. They experimented with different sizes, layouts, and even electric prototypes. But resources were always the problem. GM had endless cash to test ideas. Flxible had only enough to gamble, and when those gambles failed, the company's finances took another hit. Transit agencies began avoiding Flxible entirely. They couldn't afford the risk of investing in buses that might not last as long as GM's. Contracts dried up, orders slowed down, and every time Flxible lost a bid, GM got stronger. But the harshest truth was this: the flaws of the Flxible New Look Bus haunted the company. The design was rushed to compete with GM, and it never reached the same level of quality. Even when Flxible improved their later models, the reputation damage was done. Agencies remembered the breakdowns, the rust, the endless maintenance. And reputations are hard to rebuild. By the early 1980s, the writing was on the wall. GM wasn't just winning, they had already won. Flxible was surviving only by scraps, selling buses to smaller cities and second-tier markets. But the golden dream of taking on General Motors had collapsed. The rival had been outmatched, the flaws had caught up. And the name Flxible New Look was fading from the streets, remembered not as a success but as a struggling attempt that never truly stood a chance. Yet this story didn't end with defeat alone. Because as the years rolled forward, Flxible's fate would take one final twist, an ending that showed just how hard it was to fight against giants like GM. By the 1980s, the fight was nearly over. General Motors had cemented its dominance, and the famous Fishbowl buses were still rolling strong across North America. Flxible, once the small-town challenger that dared to take on the giant, was exhausted. Their new look buses had never reached the standard needed to compete, and their reputation had been bruised too many times. But Flxible wasn't ready to surrender quietly. In the 1980s, they introduced newer models like the Flxible Metro, hoping to reinvent themselves and escape the shadow of the flawed new look design. These buses were stronger, more reliable, and in many ways a big improvement. For a short while, it looked like Flxible might find a second life. Some transit agencies even gave them another chance. Yet the damage was already done. Transit managers remembered the frustrations of the older Flxible New Look buses, the rusting frames, the constant repairs, the uneven rides. Reputation in the transit world moves slowly, and once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to win back. Meanwhile, GM eventually stepped back from the transit bus market in the late 1980s, but by then the playing field had changed. New competitors like Orion, Gillig, and New Flyer were entering with modern designs. They learned from the mistakes of both GM and Flxible. They offered buses that were better suited for the changing needs of American cities, and agencies were eager to try fresh alternatives. Flxible sadly couldn't keep up. By the 1990s, their financial troubles grew worse. Orders dropped, debts piled up, and the company was sold to new owners in a desperate attempt to stay alive, but nothing could reverse the tide. In 1995, Flxible built its last bus. After more than 80 years in business, the company closed its doors forever. The Flxible New Look buses that had once been meant to rival GM slowly disappeared from the streets. Some were scrapped, some were sold to smaller agencies, and a few ended up in the hands of collectors. But unlike GM's iconic Fishbowls, which became symbols of an era, the Flxible New Look faded quietly.